Buying a pre-built PC is an easy and almost effortless way to get into PC gaming. Though at times, pricing isn't all that great and the quality of those machines can sometimes be mediocre at most. Building a PC, on the other hand, will give you flexibility in how much you need to spend, customization, better value, and so much more. If you're considering building a PC and you're afraid or unsure, don't be. Putting together a computer is a really fun experience. Even if you don't have a clue about what part does what, don't worry. In this video, I'll be doing a build guide for a $450-ish PC that can play games at medium to high settings. Though, you don't have to use my parts if you already have your parts chosen. Anyways, let's get started. Okay, so let's do a quick rundown of the parts I've chosen. For the CPU, I went with the Ryzen 3 2200G. This is great for media consumption, light gaming, and even some content creation. This is a quad-core chip, which in 2019 is very much average, but enough for what we'll be putting together. It also features onboard graphics, which we won't be using, but if you have to cut corners on the budget, it will still run games exceptionally well. This CPU is a $90 to $100. Next up is the motherboard. The board I went with is the Asus Prime B350M-A. This is a micro ATX board that supports the first generation AMD Ryzen processors. To avoid the trouble going through to flash the BIOS to support second gen chips like the 2200G, I would get the B450M-A of this board, or better yet, any B450 board that is ATX or micro ATX. I'll link some in the description below. Anyways, this board cost me $63.99. For memory, I went with a 2x4 kit of Crucial Ballistics memory. Having the 2 sticks of RAM instead of just one will help with performance because Ryzen benefits with faster memory and dual channel. The speed of the RAM I have is 2400 MHz, which isn't too bad, but I recommend 3000 MHz or higher, while keeping it in dual channel or 2 sticks. This cost me $65. The power supply is the EVGA 450BT. For this build, 600 watts is what I'd recommend, but this is what I have to use for now. I got this for $21, but I can't stress it enough. Unless you don't buy a discrete graphics card, please spend the extra cash on a 600 watt or greater power supply. For storage, I went with 2 drives. For the boot drive, I got the Silicon Power 120 gigs SSD for $20. This will hold Windows 10 along with basic apps like Chrome and Office apps. An SSD is different rather than a typical hard drive because there are no moving parts, meaning that it doesn't have to spin up when loading something. It will almost instantly open up an app like Chrome, and booting into Windows will take mere seconds. These are much faster than a typical spinning hard drive. Unless you have the money for it, high-capacity solid-state drives are very expensive yet becoming cheaper nonetheless. Still, to save money, a cheap hard drive will suffice. I personally have this used $20 500GB Toshiba drive, but I'd highly recommend going for a terabyte or more. Now for the graphics card, the part that will run all of your intense games. Now when building a computer, you don't have to buy latest gen hardware. Going used and previous gen can not only get you more performance for your dollar, but you can even save money. The graphics card I went with is actually a 6-year-old high-end NVIDIA GeForce GTX 780 Ti that at the time retailed for over $700, but can now be found for $120 to $150. Now, games 6 years ago were not as intensive and detailed as they are now, but this card will have very similar if not better performance than the mid-range NVIDIA GTX 1060 and AMD Radeon RX 580. Now, going used is great, but you usually don't get any long-term warranty, and who knows what evil things the original owner did to the part. If you don't want to risk anything, I'd recommend the NVIDIA GTX 1060 or AMD RX 580, or 570. Not only do they both perform exceptionally well, they should run on the 450 watt power supply very comfortably, and can still be had for great prices. Next up is the case. For $40 to $50, the Deepcool Matrix 55 has ample space for all of our components. Real front and side glass panels, RGB, USB 3, and a bottom-mounted power supply. Now, as great as all of this sounds, this case has 0 fans, meaning you might, should buy some fans to keep air flowing. There are other slight inconveniences that I will cover in my review of the case, but overall, other than needing fans, very nice case. All of this will vary in price. If you don't go with the graphics card I have and use the integrated graphics, the system will edge nearer to $300. But if you go with my config plus the cost of fans, you'll be looking closer to $450 to $500, give or take. This system, with tweaks to some of those slightly outdated components like the older motherboard and slower RAM, will get you 60 or higher frames per second in most modern games. Anyways, let's begin. Before we start opening up boxes, you need to be sure your building space is safe. First, make sure you have enough space to work with. I'm going to be building on a majority of this plastic table. Also make sure that your table or whatever isn't conductive, so no metal tables. Also don't build on a carpet floor because static charge from say your socks can damage components, so don't wear socks, put some shoes on, or just build on a floor other than carpet. To decrease the chance of shocking components, pull out the power supply from its box, plug it in, turn it on, and while you're building, just touch it every now and then to prevent the chance of shocking your components. There is also a special wristband to help with this. I'll put a link to it in the description. But if you do what I said about plugging in the power supply and touching it, you should be fine. As for what materials you'll need, you only really need a Phillips head screwdriver and some zip ties. To fully tighten the zip ties, some pliers, preferably needle nose, would be useful. If you have it, a magnetic spark tray will help organize all of your screws so you know where they are. Also keep the motherboard manual handy because for the front panel connectors, unless you know how to read the headers on the motherboard, you'll probably need it. Since I'll be showing you what to do, you won't actually need most of the manuals, but I wouldn't completely disregard them either. Anyways, the build should take around an hour, maybe more, maybe less. Anyways, let's get building. So first, we're going to install our CPU and RAM into the motherboard. So grab the box with the Ryzen logo. Another package should be a bit slimmer with 2 sticks of memory in it. And the motherboard box will usually be a square box with a picture of the board on the front and all of its features. Take the board out of its box, place the box on your workspace, and remove the board from its anti-static bag. Put the bag in a safe place, you might need to use it in the future. Anyways, place the motherboard on its box, this will act as our test bench. Now open up the Ryzen box, take out the little rectangular box, slide out the CPU and its plastic clamshell, and now very gently, with the gold pins facing down, open up the clamshell and without touching the gold pins or the top of the IHS, grab the CPU from the sides and set it down for a second. Back on the motherboard, locate the CPU socket. It should look like a square with lots of tiny holes in it. Once you find it, you should see a little arm right next to it. This doesn't require any force, just push the arm slightly outward and push it up. Now that the socket is open, handling the CPU only by its sides, look for a small triangle in the corner of the CPU and match it up with the one in the motherboard. Once you've done that, carefully align the CPU with the socket and place it on the socket. It should fall right in, but if not, pick it up just a little and reinsert it. Try moving it around a little, and if it doesn't budge, congratulations, you've just installed your CPU. Now, push the arm back to the down right position. It might take a little bit of force, so don't worry if you need to push a little harder on the arm. Now grab the RAM box, open it up, and take out the 2 sticks of memory. Now locate the DIMM slots on your motherboard. They look like this. Once you've done that, push back the little clip on the 2 DIMM sticks I have, so the outer right and the inner left. Or consult your manual to double check which slots to use if you have 2 sticks. After you've done that, with the little tab open, line up the stick with the slot. There should be a little notch in the middle that aligns with the slot. Put the memory stick in the slot and press on both sides until it snaps into place. Rinse and repeat on the other stick, and congratulations, you've just installed your memory. Now let's move on to the next step. Now, before we set the motherboard aside, we need to install the cooler. Inside the Ryzen box is another box. Pull the box out, open it, remove the top plastic, and carefully remove the cooler from the box and don't touch the bottom because the thermal paste is there. If the cooler didn't stick to the bottom plastic insert, remove it and place it on the cooler to shield the thermal paste from any dust or other particles. Set that aside for a second. On your motherboard, you should see 2 plastic pieces held down by screws. If you're going to use the included AMD cooler, then these will have to be removed. But if you have an aftermarket cooler, you'll have to keep these in place. Before we remove these, I'll show you how to mount an aftermarket cooler. To demonstrate, I'll be using my Arctic Freezer Extreme Revision 2 cooler. All you need are 2 little brackets like these, and these 2 screws. Place each bracket under the cooler like so, making sure the holes line up with the screws, and screw them through the hole, but only a little so that the bracket is just hanging off by a little bit. Now, put one of the brackets on the mount like this, and with a bit of pressure, do the same on the other. Then you can fully screw both sides into place. Don't forget thermal paste if the cooler didn't come with it. Anyways, if you plan on using the stock cooler, use your screwdriver to remove the screws holding the plastic mounting hardware. Once you've done that, put that in a safe place and get out the AMD cooler. Line up the cooler screws with the holes in the motherboard. Try not to wiggle the cooler too much once you've set it down on the CPU. Anyways, once the cooler has been aligned, screw it down with a cross pattern to make sure that pressure is being evenly distributed. Don't tighten too much, but make sure the screws are tight enough. Once that is completed, locate the cable coming from the fan. Put it in a little loop like this to keep it tidy and plug it into the CPU fan header. It should be near the CPU socket and the cable only goes in one way. Once you've clipped it into place, your CPU cooler is now installed. Now to get started with the case. Unbox the case with extra care so you don't break anything. Remove the side glass. Remember, be careful. Place it in a safe place, like the box. Now, remove the bag of screws and set that to the side. Take out the manual and also set that to the side. Now, if you haven't already, get out the power supply and screws if it has them. If not, they look like this and should be in the case screw bag. Remove any protective plastic, and with the fan facing downward, place it down on the case right here and slide it into the cutout all the way. Screw in the power supply with the 4 screws to their corresponding holes. Take all of the cables from the power supply and push them through this cutout on the motherboard tray. In your motherboard box, pull out the input-output shield that looks like this. From the inside of your case, with the tabs of the shield facing towards you, pop it in place, making sure the audio ports are on the bottom. It will take a bit of effort, but once you get it in, now we can install the motherboard. Now before we do that, make sure there are 6 standoffs installed on the case. If not, there should be extra in our case bag of screws. To install them, screw them into the holes like so, and hand tighten them. Now, lay the case on its side, grab the motherboard, and gently line up the I/O with the input-output shield, and line up the holes with the standoffs. This might take a bit, so take your time until you get it right. Once you've done that, get the screws that look like this and screw the motherboard in place. Get your hard drive and SSD, they look like this. Unscrew the 2 drive bays, slide the hard drive into the slot with the SATA plugins facing the back of the case. Use some of these screws to secure it in place and slide it back into the slot. For the solid state drive, use the bottom holes to mount it into place. Again, slide it back in and screw it in tight. Now get out the SATA cable. You might need to buy another from the motherboard box and plug it in like so on the smaller port of the hard drive. Route it through this hole and plug it into the port on the motherboard. It only goes in one way. Rinse and repeat for the solid state drive. Now to install some case fans. Remove the front panel by pulling on the cutout on the bottom and popping it off. Angle it to the side so you have some more space to install the fans. Use these screws to install any case fan. With the fan facing this way, place it closer outwards of the case and use the slots to screw it into place. Rinse and repeat for the other 2 slots. For the rear fan mount, face the fan the same way as I did for the front and screw it in. For the top, install the fan with the exhaust facing upward. Now it's time to wire the power supply. First look for the 20 plus 4 pin cable, it's the biggest one. Run it through this hole and connect the 4 pin to the 24 pin like this, and plug it into the motherboard firmly. It should snap into place and only goes in one way. Next, locate the 4 plus 4 pin CPU EPS connector. Route it through this hole and connect both 4 pins together and plug it into the CPU power slot. Only goes in one way and requires some force. Now look for the SATA power cables and plug them into the SSD and hard drive. Again, only goes in one way. Something else I forgot to mention is plugging in all of the fans. My board only has one header, so you'll need to plug in the exhaust on the header and grab some Molex cables from the power supply and plug in all of the fans that way. Now for the most difficult and tedious part, wiring the front panel. If you haven't already, put the front panel back on, routing all the cables through the holes. Okay, first locate the cable with the HD audio label and connect it to this header, making sure the pins line up. This would be a great time to consult your motherboard manual. Anyways, locate the USB label connector and plug it into this header like so. Now find the USB 3 cable, this is the thickest of them all, line it up with the USB 3 header and plug it in. Now for the hard part, the power switch, LED, reset switch, and hard drive LED. This can be a bit of a pain, so check your motherboard manual to see how the pesky connectors go on your motherboard. The hard drive LED and reset button go like this, left to right. Right above the hard drive LED from left to right, the green power positive LED, then the negative white power LED. And next to that finally is the power switch orange cable left and white cable right. Now let's go back and install the graphics card. Remove the two PCI covers corresponding to the PCI EX16 slot, which looks like this on your motherboard. Push the clip back on the slot and pull out the graphics card from its box, remove any plastic covers on it, line up the card with the PCIe slot, and snap it in fully in place. Now grab some screws from the bag of case screws and screw the card in place. Now before we move on, look for a power supply cable labeled VGA. Plug in one 6-pin VGA, leaving the extra 2 hanging to the side, and connect the other 6 plus 2 pin together and connect it to the 8-pin connector on the card. Now let's get all your peripherals plugged in. USB keyboard and mouse go in the USB ports, and PS-2 peripherals go in their corresponding port. Plug in your mic to the pink audio jack, and any speakers or headset to the green 3.5mm jack. Now for your monitor, and be sure to pay attention to this or you won't be using your graphics card. Plug your monitor only into the graphics card, which is right here. The I/O on the motherboard only outputs the integrated graphics, which is alright if you are going to use that and don't have a graphics card, but just be sure to plug it in into the graphics card if you have a discrete one. Now, plug in the power for your monitor and power supply, and we're almost ready to fire it up. Now, before we turn on the machine, you should make sure everything's plugged in so you don't freak out if the system doesn't power on. Make sure your monitor is getting power and is on standby, make sure it's set to the correct source, and make sure the power supply is switched on. Once you've checked that, go ahead and press the spring-loaded power button, and hopefully you'll see your PC come to life. The display will show you the American Megatrends logo, followed by a list of devices and some other stuff. It will tell you to press F1 for setup. If your system hasn't gotten this far, check the front panel headers and manual to see if everything's connected properly. Also make sure that all the power supply connections are good. If you've gotten this far, congrats! You've just built your own personal computer. Now that you've gotten that out of the way, you're going to need to install your choice of operating system, so you can actually use your system. Unless of course you just want to gaze upon the wonderful and mysterious BIOS menu. A video on installing an OS to your new PC is in the works and will be released soon, but for now though, I'd recommend preparing the materials you'll need to install your OS, which are a flash drive and a Windows computer with access to the internet, running what I believe needs to be at least Windows 7, don't quote me on that. Also make sure that your newly built PC has some sort of way to access the internet. It's not mandatory, but I'd recommend it. So an Ethernet cable connected to your modem or some type of wireless adapter via USB port or PCI slot. Anyways guys, I hope that this video helped you build your computer.
If you're having some trouble, leave a comment and I'll do my best to help you out. If you enjoyed the video, hit that like button. While you're there, consider subscribing to the channel and hit that bell for more quality tech videos. Anyways, thanks for watching and I'll see you later.